After over 2 decades of service, my old Game Boy Advance is no longer working properly. It's had a lot of use over the years, as can be seen by the number of scuffs and scratches on it, though it's not too bad given its age. It's had a couple of upgrades over the years with a glass display cover and a backlit LCD, though I do still have the original display just in case. I was just going to grab some batteries so that I can show what the problem is. Assuming these batteries are charged, the console should still power on. It's just very picky about the games that it wants to play. It turns out the batteries were dead, so I've just gone and charged them, and now we come back to turn the Game Boy on, and as you can see it does turn on, but there isn't currently a game in there, which is why it doesn't go any further. So now we'll try it with a game. I've got a working copy of Pokemon Emerald, which works perfectly fine through a Nintendo DS. And as we can see, it's not able to recognise the cartridge at all. I won't do this now, but I have tried the basic. The cartridge is clean, and as I say, it does work on a Nintendo DS, so I know the cartridge itself is fine. And now we'll try the Game Boy game Pokemon Silver. And as we can see, it has no trouble whatsoever reading the Game Boy game. And this is true for my entire game collection. Not a single Game Boy Advance game will be read by the console, but every single Game Boy game works perfectly fine. So there is clearly something wrong with this console that's preventing it from playing Game Boy Advance games. Now occasionally it does manage to detect a game, as you can see here with this copy of Pokemon Fire Red. But on the odd occasion that this occurs, it still never manages to actually boot the game or go any further. And to show it's not the game cartridge at fault, here's the same game being booted successfully on a Nintendo DS. To open a Game Boy Advance, you're going to need a small tri-wing screwdriver, and I've got an iFixit set which has got the bit that's needed. While I'm opening the console, I'm just going to explain a little bit about what I'm going to be looking for and what I think might be causing the problem. Game cartridges for the Game Boy Advance and the original Game Boy run at different voltages. The Game Boy Advance runs at 3.3 volts and the original Game Boy runs at 5 volts. To ensure that the console is giving the correct voltage to the cartridge, there's actually a little switch that is activated only when an original Game Boy cartridge is inserted. It's why Game Boy Advance games have a little cutout section in the corner to make sure that this switch isn't being pressed. It's not only the voltage that this changes though, it also causes the console to boot in an entirely separate mode, which gives you things like the screen scaling option when you're using an original Game Boy game. It's possible that if this switch is faulty, it's causing the console to try and boot into the incorrect mode. Now I don't think that's the issue in this case, because the console is sometimes able to detect the game. It just doesn't get any further. But it's something to take a look at anyway, and it's worth mentioning because if someone's having a similar problem with only one type of game cartridge working, it's possible that that will be the culprit. Though I think it's more likely that this is the problem if original Game Boy games were the ones that weren't working. The other thing I'll be looking for is if there's any cold solder joints. The fact that it does occasionally boot up means it's possible that there's a connection somewhere which isn't quite making contact properly. The replacement display is a bit of a squeeze inside the case, so it's possible that's put a bit of pressure on the board and could have led to something not connecting properly. The problem with this of course is cold solder joints are not always obvious, so we'll have to see what we find when I've got it open. Once the tri-wing screws are out, there is one additional screw that you have to remove, which is in the battery compartment. This is a Phillips head screw, though in the case of this console here it has corroded quite badly, so it's one I'm going to have to be quite careful trying to remove. Well, in the end that's actually come out quite easily, but I think having the right size of screwdriver is really important if you're working with screws, which you can see are already damaged. With the back cover off now, we can see the rather simple board that makes up the Game Boy Advance. And you can just see through there as well the replacement display that I've previously installed, with this slightly janky looking cable that's stuck to the back of it. I think there are certainly much cleaner solutions now than there were when I got this display. So that's something I might look at swapping out in the future. But first, let's see if we can actually get it working again. So one of the things I wanted to look at was the switch in the cartridge slot. So we'll just take a look at that now and see if it seems to be switching correctly. So here is a closer up view of the cartridge slot, and you can see the little switch that I was talking about earlier, which is pressed down when an original Game Boy or Game Boy Color cartridge is inserted. But a Game Boy Advance cartridge won't cause this to be pushed. It does seem to be moving correctly, and there are no signs of any damage to it. So I think it's fine from a physical perspective, though I will just double check the voltages with each cartridge inserted to check that it's definitely functioning properly. To get the PCB out completely, there's 3 more Phillips head screws that need to be removed. You'll also want to be careful of some of the pieces of plastic, such as the power switch and the R and L buttons, that will fall out when you remove the PCB. So you just want to make sure not to lose them. To make it easier to test, I'm going to be removing the board entirely, which means unplugging the display. To do this, you need to unlock the latch holding the cable in place and gently pull it out. This aftermarket display also has a wire which is soldered to the board, so I also had to desolder this, though if you're still using the stock display there won't be anything to desolder. Once the screen is unplugged, the board can be lifted out. To check the voltages coming out of the cartridge slot, I'm just going to probe 2 points on the board just below the cartridge slot pins. These 2 pins are ground and VDD35. Now VDD35 is the pin that will carry either 3.3 volts or 5 volts depending on which cartridge is installed. I'll try it first with no game inserted, as a Game Boy Advance game doesn't press the switch anyway, so it's only going to give the same result. Without the game inserted, we're getting around 3.3 volts, which is expected. With the Game Boy Color cartridge inserted, the cartridge slot's receiving approximately 5 volts, which is what it's supposed to be. So each cartridge is getting the correct voltage, though that doesn't mean there isn't a power issue somewhere else on the board. And to be honest, I don't really know what else I'll be looking for, or if there's anywhere else that I should be looking to test. So I'll put the multimeter away for now, and have a closer look at the board, and see if anything jumps out at me. Now I mentioned earlier that I was going to be on the lookout for potential cold solder joints. If you look at the back of the board, you'll see that the CPU is right underneath where the connector is for the new display. And because of the thickness of the display connector, you won't be able to see this on camera of course, but it is quite a tight fit when the board's actually screwed down. So it is possible that that bit of pressure on the board, if it's causing it to flex slightly, might be putting pressure in and around the CPU. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to try reflowing these pins. I'm going to add a bit of fresh solder. I mean, providing nothing's bridged at the end, it's not going to hurt anything to do this. And we'll see if that does anything. While we watch me reflowing the solder joints on the CPU, I just wanted to say, please don't do what I did here. Please add flux to the joints before reflowing them by not using flux, and ended up with a much bigger cleanup job at the end, as a lot of the pins ended up being bridged. While flux doesn't necessarily appear cheap, you only need a very small amount, so it'll last you a long time. There really isn't any reason not to use it. So as it turns out, I did make a bit of a mess of that to start with. It turns out the old solder wanted to flow very easily onto the iron and onto the surrounding pins. But it all looks good now, so let's give it a go, see if that's done anything. I will of course have to attach the screen again, so I'll do that first and then get a game in there and see if it's made any difference. Well, the console still powers on, so that's a good start. I haven't totally destroyed it. But let's get a game to try. Well, that's not what I was expecting. It's actually booted up into the game. And it's actually managed to get all the way through, so maybe there was a dodgy solder joint somewhere. But we'll have to try a few more games first. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Now let's take this one out, try one of the other games. Yeah, okay, that one's working as well now. And this one's also managed to boot all the way through. As previously some of them did try and start booting, but never managed to make it to the title screen. So I've just gone through a few more games off camera, and it turns out that all but one of my Game Boy Advance cartridges is now playing correctly. And the one that doesn't work on my DS either, so that's something with the cartridge, not with the console. With the console seeming to work, all that was left to do was to put it back together. Now that's not going to be the most interesting to watch, so I'll speed through this and point out a couple of things you'll want to watch out for. When reinstalling the display cable, you'll want to take extra care to make sure that it's fully inserted. It would be quite easy to leave it partially removed, and that would mean having to open it up again to get it inserted properly. Another thing to be careful of is when inserting the power switch, you've got to make sure the switch is in the correct position to allow the plastic part to fit in place. If you can't get the part in, simply move the power switch to the other position and then it should fit in easily. Other than that, it should be pretty simple to put back together. Just make sure you don't forget the Phillips head screw inside the battery compartment. If, like me, you've used an external power supply, you'll also need to make sure that the battery connections haven't been bent or twisted out of place, because these need to slot into the housing and need to be positioned correctly. Before screwing it back together, I'm just going to try turning it on to make sure that the screen is plugged in correctly. It's better to do it now than to have to unscrew everything if it isn't. Yep, looks good, so I'll get it screwed back together. So there we have it, my old Game Boy Advance working again as it should. Now I mentioned early on in the video that cold solder joints was something I was going to look for. And to be honest, it's one of those things that you hear mentioned a lot, but I never really expected it to be the problem. Particularly given that Game Boy Color cartridges seem to be working correctly. So I don't know enough about the Game Boy Advance to know how that would be the case if there's a cold solder joint. But anyway, the console's working now, so I'm not going to question it too much. The display cable used for the aftermarket display definitely puts a bit of pressure on the board, so I'm guessing when that was screwed down it would have just caused the board to flex slightly, which is probably what has caused this issue. There are a lot of mods available for the Game Boy Advance nowadays which wouldn't have been available back when I installed this display, so I think in the future I'll have a look at some of those mods and see what else I can do with this old Game Boy Advance, and in particular have a look at the better quality displays that are available, because the quality of this one isn't that good. So that's something you can look forward to on this channel in the future.